welcome into the program. Great to be with you this morning on a Tuesday. And this is actually feels kind of more like a Wednesday because tomorrow is going to be my last day up here, of course, the holiday season, which, by the way, I do want to make known to everybody that when in the news business, we have this concept that we refer to as the turkey coma. And that is going to be happening very soon. People tend to not pay quite as much attention to politics. They're more worried about the holidays. They're more worried about their family. They have less free time. And so they start getting just a little bit, I don't even know if it's necessarily lazy, but certainly preoccupied with other things. And so there will be a couple times that we're not going to do a broadcast because of that, but we should be here pretty much every day. I don't like being away from the audience for any extended amount of time. I doubt we'll do a show here Friday, and because of that, this probably will be the next to last show of the week. So we'll be here tomorrow, the day before Thanksgiving, and we're going to do a Thanksgiving special. And then after that, you know, we're done until the next Monday after that, and then we'll be back all the way up until just a few days before Christmas. And so I am not going to leave you guys hanging. There is much news to cover. It's important to you. It's important to me, and that's why we're going to be here bringing you the latest in what's going on in the world. And speaking of what's going on in the world, and more specifically what's going on in our world, some local news to start out this morning. Apparently, the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is their office is just a few miles from where I'm sitting right this moment. The Southern Poverty Law Center has seen fit to sue the state of Alabama, more specifically the law enforcement branch of Alabama's government, ALEA. That's going to be the ones that they're bringing the case against for suspending people's licenses. And so what they are arguing here is that when you suspend somebody's license, you are infringing upon their rights. And we'll get into the specifics of it in a second. But just to give you an understanding of the basis of this particular lawsuit, they are suing because what happens when you get a traffic ticket for whatever reason, your license can be suspended if you have not paid that ticket in a certain amount of time. So if your name is John Doe, and you've committed a speeding violation, some kind of traffic violation, and it's been a certain amount of time past your particular date that you were supposed to pay that, or you were supposed to appear in court, whatever it may be, if that takes place and you've gone past that, then the next step is they're going to suspend your license if they've been past a certain point and have not figured out how to rectify that, how to get your ticket paid. And so what the SPLC is alleging here is they are saying that somehow ALEA is violating the 14th Amendment by doing this. Now, here's the thing. This whole complaint spurs from the idea that you've got somebody in a situation that they cannot pay. So somebody that is living in poverty may have racked up $1,000 or some ridiculous amount in traffic tickets, which if that's the case, then you've committed multiple traffic violations. And driving on a suspended license is only going to rack up more debt. And so they're saying that this is a way to discriminate against poor people. And they say it's not right that they suspend a person's license before looking at their ability to pay. So there's a couple reasons why this is not necessarily the best case to make here. First of all, and as somebody who has gone to court with a traffic violation complaint, I can tell you that this is something that I have a little experience. I don't want to make out like I'm some kind of expert or I've been through this 100 times. I've been through it once, and so I have a little bit of personal experience with this, which I understand a little bit of understanding can make you dangerous. But just from my experience and what I've seen, and not just my case, looking at other people's cases as well while this whole process was going on, one thing that has seemed to be a continuing theme is that they're not going to do this for a first offense. And so unless you have just completely ignored the court system, in other words, your court date is come and gone, you gave no effort to contact them, no effort to get in touch with the authorities and let them know, because if you go to court, even if you committed the crime, you can work out a plan to where you can pay parts of it. And I've known this from roommates that I had in college. I've known this from other people that have gotten caught in a situation where they couldn't pay all of it right away. And so the courts actually will work with you and won't suspend your license if you're making regular payments. The issue that's coming about here, and the people that the Southern Poverty Law Center is dealing with, is people that specifically don't pay their bills, have no plan to pay their bills, have not contacted the courts, and continue to drive anyway, even after their license has been suspended. However, I want to take a step back for just a second, because this is something that's frustrating with me personally about the Southern Poverty Law Center. It's not uncommon for me to have just a hint of understanding of where they're coming from, because they're saying that a big fine like that can be virtually impossible to pay, virtually impossible for somebody to pay down when they're in that situation, which is part of the reason that we're supposed to be having a court session with them to figure out exactly what is acceptable, what they can pay, what they can't pay. And so this is the issue that you're running into. The vast majority of the cases that they are kind of bringing up as examples would be a case where a person has completely ignored their duty to follow the law and pay their fine. Because if you are in a situation to where you charge them for the fine and they ignore you and don't come to court and don't pay the fine and make no payments on it, and then they rack up another fine, or they get their license suspended and then have another fine on top of that for driving on a suspended license, which is a really big deal, this would be the person that has completely ignored the law at every step. And the Southern Poverty Law Center is saying it's wrong to take that person's license. Now, there's an element of truth to this. I don't think it's right that the state would suspend somebody's license without notifying them first, whether it's sending them a letter, sending them an email, something, and letting them know that their license has been suspended. That I do think they should do. And if the result of this is some kind of legislation that repairs that kind of loophole or that kind of crack in the system, I'm perfectly okay with that. What I don't agree with is the idea that somebody should be able to do all of that and still not have any legal consequences. The suspension of a license is a legal punishment. What it is the state of Alabama is saying, you have proven you are not responsible with this privilege, therefore we must take it away from you. And that's really the issue that you're running into. They're saying you can't be trusted because you have violated the law in this particular area of your life over and over again, and you've made no attempts to rectify it. We have no other option than to take that privilege from you. And if you, after we've taken this privilege from you, continue to drive on public roads, then you're going to be punished for it. And there's a myriad of reasons why that's actually a good idea. Having unsafe drivers that commit traffic violations all the time and don't seem to make any effort to correct it, that causes everybody else's insurance to go up. Uninsured or unlicensed drivers are a huge risk factor when it comes to insurance. And of course, there's also the chance that somebody could lose their life because of this. And so I am sympathetic to the argument that the Southern Poverty Law Center wants to make, up to the extent that they're saying we need to bring down these fines. They're too expensive. We need to figure out a way to make it easier to pay for those people. Now, it has to hurt some, because if it doesn't hurt at all, it's not a punishment. For example, you want the punishment to fit the crime. I mean, you don't want the death penalty for somebody shoplifting a candy bar, but at the same time, you want there to be some penalty for shoplifting a candy bar, or people just come in and take candy bars, and then the business owner has no way to recoup that loss. And so there has to be some punishment. And if the Southern Poverty Law Center's stance is, well, the punishment is too severe for the crime, I'm open to hearing that. But the idea that somehow they're making a constitutional breach by doing so, no. There is a due process, according to the Fifth Amendment, that is being followed here to punish somebody that is in violation of the law. And that punishment, by definition, does have to sting, does have to financially hurt them to be an adequate deterrent for them to do it again. And if that deterrent fails, in other words, they refuse to pay the fine, then jail time or a suspension of the license is appropriate at that point. I think that they need to notify the person. I think that's a fair point that the SPLC is making. But the idea that you shouldn't be able to take that person's license, well, what do you want them to do? Because at that point, if they can't get the fine from somebody and they can't suspend the person's license, the only thing left is throwing them in jail. And I'm pretty sure that the Southern Poverty Law Center would crow about that and say, well, they're just jailing poor people because they can't pay. Well, Again, the inability to pay, the fact that it does financially hurt you, that's what makes it a deterrent. If you make every traffic violation $15, then nobody's going to obey the traffic laws. Now, granted, I think that $200-$300 ticket for speeding is a little bit ridiculous, but you don't want it to not cost the person anything, or to be something that they can just throw away and they can continue to violate the law and know that, they're willing to pay it, and basically think of it as almost a tax on being able to break the law. You don't want that. And so you have to find that balance to where it hurts them just enough to keep them from trying to do it again. And I understand the SPLC is saying, look, the purpose of these laws is not to sink people financially. I get that, but you also can't make it not sting at all, because then it doesn't work as a punishment. And so that's really the balance that you're trying to strike here. But here's what's really odd. Here's what's really strange to me. Why a 14th Amendment violation? Maybe that's just the reflex of liberals now, that anytime there's a law they don't like, they say, well, I don't know how, but somehow it's a violation of the 14th Amendment. Look, I've read the 14th Amendment over and over again. I don't know how many times. It never mentions anything about traffic laws. It doesn't mention anything about legal fines. I'm sorry, it's not in there. Equal protection under the law has nothing to do with punishing a lawbreaker. Now, does a fine hurt a poor person more than it does an expensive person? Yes, but they committed the same crime. So your only option is, if you want to hurt the rich person, which unfortunately I think the SPLC actually does want to do, if you're wanting to hurt the rich person more, then the only way to do that would be to charge them more for breaking the same crime, which is completely unfair. And that's one thing that is a little bit ironic about what liberals would refer to as justice. Somehow in their mind, punishing people based on their means is equal justice. No, equal justice is treating everybody the same, regardless of whether they're black or white, rich or poor, Hispanic, male, female, Greek, Sicilian, if you want to use the Bible's language, however you want to say it. What blind justice is you break the law, you pay this price, doesn't matter who you are. That's what equal protection under the law actually means. And so the case that the SPLC, I can't imagine that this is going to go very far. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this turns into a whole big thing. But I just do not see anywhere close to a good basis for the 14th Amendment violation here. I don't see that. And the thing is, really deep down, once you get past all the social justice stuff, I think underneath there is actually a pretty good point to be made here, which is the fees for a large portion of the jurisdictions in the state of Alabama for violating speeding laws are ridiculous. I remember at one point I had an issue with speeding, and look, it was my fault. I messed up. Even though I thought that the circumstances were a little bit unfair because I got nabbed moving from one speed zone to the other. In other words, I just passed the sign, but nonetheless, I was breaking the law. That's neither here nor there. And unfortunately, they nailed me for not having my license renewed. It wasn't suspended. It just hadn't been renewed. And the reason that they did that, which I understand he was just doing his job and it was an oversight on my part, was that I was going through chemo at the time. And because of that, I did get a notification to renew my license, renew my tag, not renew my license. My license was good. My tag had not been renewed. So I did get a notification to renew my tag, but I'd forgotten about it because I was going through chemo at the time. I had other things that I had to worry about. But nonetheless, if you're looking at it by the letter of the law, I was in violation of both of those laws when the guy pulled me over. But the fee for that was over $400. And that is ridiculous. And unfortunately, I think what's going on here is that a lot of jurisdictions, like my own in Alabama, they have such exorbitant prices for that specifically because they look at them as revenue. They look at those as a way to get income. And that's not the purpose of the fees. The fees can be used for that, and I'm glad that they can be used to help our police officers and everything, but you should not look at that as a source of income, and you certainly shouldn't look at it as a fundraising endeavor. And I think a lot of jurisdictions in the state of Alabama do that, and they rely on that income. And that's not a good position to be in. It should be looked at as bonus money, essentially. And so the fees that they wind up collecting Unfortunately, they want to increase that, and because of that, they keep increasing the amount of the fines, and that's not right either. We have to keep in mind the actual purpose of those fines. If you want to do more with something, if your community needs, I don't know, another squad car, something, then either do a fundraiser, sell bonds, or collect taxes. But don't use fines incurred from law violations as some sort of revenue getting endeavor. That's not a good thing. So underneath all of the SPLC's liberal craziness, I actually do think there's a good point to be made there, but they're definitely attacking it on the wrong grounds. They're definitely not attacking it on the correct grounds, because I cannot see them getting a case to where it rules in their favor that there was an actual 14th Amendment violation. So one other thing that I wanted to mention, a really somber story, and you guys know my rule. And there are going to be people I know that are using this as political fodder, although not as much as I am accustomed to, surprisingly. I guess it was because the death toll wasn't very high. But there was another shooting the other night in Chicago. I think it was actually yesterday afternoon. But anyway, the other day in Chicago at Mercy Hospital, there was a shooting, and based on, I'm just going to give you the facts because you guys know my 48-hour rule. I don't talk about politics until at least 2 days after a tragedy has taken place. So 3 were killed. The gunman also died as well, but they're not really sure how that happened. And so they're not sure if he shot himself or they're not sure if he was hit by police officers. That's really not clear at this time. But either way, he's gone too. And so there were 3 that were dead, if you don't count the shooter. And which means technically this does not qualify as a mass shooting, which thank the Lord that's the case, not because I'm afraid of there being another mass shooting, but because had it been a mass shooting, that would have been more people died. So thankfully, as horrible as it is that 3 people were murdered in a brutal fashion this way, at least it wasn't more. I am very thankful for that. And the people that died were a police officer in the line of duty who is being hailed today as a hero, and by the way, should be. And then the other 2 people were a hospital employee that was just getting off of the elevator, somebody completely unconnected to the incident. And the 3rd person was the actual target of the gunman, who was apparently a girlfriend or a romantic interest of the person doing the shooting. And so based on that, and based on it being somebody he knows and there being a fight there, it seems as though this was a domestic dispute that wound up hurting other people in the process. So he went to the hospital, had a firearm on him. They say that he concealed it under his clothes, which even though I haven't seen an actual report confirming this, I assume that means he was using a handgun. I mean, I guess technically he could have had a rifle or a shotgun or something, but if that were the case, it seems to me that would have been much harder to conceal under his clothes. And so I don't want to say for sure, but it's very likely it was a handgun that was used in the shooting. And when this crazy person attacked and killed his girlfriend, he also killed the hospital employee and wound up killing a police officer in the line of duty and was making his escape when he was killed. And so again, we don't know if he killed himself or that was actually police officers that wound up hitting him that killed him. But either way, he is now dead too. So really tragic situation. Please pray for the people in Chicago. And yes, regardless of what idiots in the media tell you, that does matter. That is significant. In fact, not only is it helping, it is the greatest form of help that we can give. Doesn't mean that we can't help in other ways. Doesn't mean that when tragedies like this happen, we can't give monetary donations or we can't help people in other ways. But the primary source of our helping ought to be prayer. It can accompany other ways of helping, but prayer is always the most helpful thing that we can do. And so even though this looks like a domestic dispute, it doesn't look like there was terrorism involved. It doesn't look like there was a robbery or anything like that. It looks like it was specifically this guy was targeting his girlfriend for whatever reason it may be. We certainly do send our prayers to the families of those that are affected and hope that they can do this, because one thing that I was questioning about, hospitals usually have pretty decent security. And it's one of the few places that I go that I disarm myself because I know it's against hospital policy, and also because I know that there are armed guards there that keep watch over that. And one of the things that I was really questioning is, especially you would think in a city like Chicago that has a ridiculous level of gun crime and violent crime in general, that you would have security guards there that are vigilant, that are armed. So my question is, because this person was a boyfriend, maybe it was somebody who was still with her, not like an estranged boyfriend, an ex or something like that. Maybe this was a person that the security guards knew, and because of that, they let this guy through or something. But it seems to me very strange that the guy was able to get through with a gun in the first place. And I guess we'll find out about that as time goes on. And again, I'm not trying to point fingers or be vindictive. I'm just asking the question. How is it that this guy was able to get a gun through there? And again, I'm not offering any policy solutions because, like I said, I've got my 48-hour rule on this and I stick to it. But I'm just wondering exactly how that took place. And I'm hoping that once we have those details, then we will have a better handle, a better understanding of what we can do to prevent this in the future and come up with some actual real working solutions. And that will probably be in the days to come. But certainly our thoughts and prayers go out to all those who were affected by the Mercy hospital shooting there in Chicago. We were talking about the Chicago shooting right before we took a break. And there is another tragedy that is going on, but thankfully the Babylon Bee is on top of things. I just had to mention this because it's such a feel-good story. For those of you who are unaware, the Babylon Bee is sort of a satire site, but it mostly leans towards sort of the evangelical Christian voting bloc. And so there's a lot of jokes about preaching and church, and there's also a lot of jokes about politics that kind of affect us. And one that they did the other day was really good. They were talking about the California wildfires and, of course, the absolute tragedy that's going on there. But I've always been someone that believes, and I know that there's probably going to be some differences of opinion here, but I've always believed that one of the best ways to get through a crisis is to be able to have a little bit of fun with it and to laugh. You want to be respectful, of course, for people that were affected, but I've always just found that laughing and making light of something can be really helpful, very therapeutic when you're going through something hard. And I think the Babylon Bee does a great job of that when you need something to chuckle about. I posted this the other day to my personal Facebook page, so if you want to check that out, you can. Donald Trump's new policy, according to them, to put out the California wildfires is deploying water Pokemon. It has a picture of Trump with a Blastoise. Anyway, very clever Babylon Bee. Well done. Good article. They are always entertaining. So check out my friends at the Babylon Bee if you need some satire. You need to make light of some of the political situations, because as rough as the news can be from time to time, and right now it kind of is, the Babylon Bee can be a great way to kind of, reset and get a much needed chuckle in to some of what's going on in the world. But speaking of the president, and we're not going to go into his policy on Pokemon, even though that would be an interesting topic. When it comes to Donald Trump, the guy actually, I think, has two superpowers. You've probably heard me mention one or the other, but I think that there's really two of them. And the first one, it's not really relevant now. It's just sort of relevant all the time. I think he has the ability to compress time. If you've ever played Final Fantasy VIII, there's a character in there. She's actually the final boss of the game, named Ultimecia. And Ultimecia's plan is to rule all of, not only the entire world, but all of time. And she does this through a process of time compression to where like everything's happening at the same time. I think that Trump has maybe a limited scope of this exact same power, because the way that a news week works has been completely undone since Trump came on the scene. And I'm not even talking necessarily about since he's been president. I'm talking about since he's been running for office. Because basically a few months after Trump really started picking up steam in his campaign, there was this weird feeling of there's a new crisis every single day. And there's actually 2 or 3 crises every single day. And so it feels like I've done a whole week's worth of news, usually in at least 1 or 2 broadcasts. So after maybe a week or two, it feels like we had enough news that usually covered an entire week before then. And that's why, and I'm not the only news person that has said this, There's so many other people that have said that feeling kind of exists. I remember Eric Bolling bringing up something. He's like, it just feels like every news week now has about 3 or 4 different news weeks in it. And I think that maybe Trump has that superpower, because it feels like when he tweets something and it completely derails, and then a few hours later he has some kind of faux pas with a foreign leader, and then he announces he's going to do something else by lunchtime. It really does feel like we're having about a week's worth of news compressed into one day, and it's exhausting. And you can't cover it all. There's always been more news than any one person could cover. But I mean, now it just feels like there's a mountain of news, really important stuff that you never even get to, that would be big news in any other news week. But every news week is like that. And so that's part of one of Trump's superpowers. And that one's just kind of my own personal theory. The second one, I think, is actually his more prevalent superpower, and one that can be used for good, sometimes is used for evil. And so it's almost like that comic book kind of feeling that, should I use my powers to fight crime or my own enrichment? And in Trump's case, I think that it's a little bit of both. There are times when he uses this superpower very well, and he's the best at it, which is somehow when somebody opposes Trump, especially when that person happens to be a progressive or a Democrat or a socialist, it's like he brings all the worst parts of who they are to the surface. Now, granted, by comparison, he doesn't look much better, because virtually everybody, even his supporters, will say, yeah, personally, I don't care for Trump a whole lot. But for whatever reason, I guess it's like he's the Swamp Thing. And so he's not necessarily all that appealing himself. But what he does is he grabs you and he just drags you down into it. And so you're down there in the mud with him. And I don't know how, but it seems like every time somebody is opposing Trump, they are just fuming, they're angry, they're furious. And somehow the Trump effect that has happened to them, the Trump derangement syndrome, brings forth all their crazy ideas or all their worst impulses right there to the surface. I mean, it even happened with Marco Rubio. You'll remember that Marco Rubio, who's always been seen as this clean-cut, polite, never says anything bad about anybody kind of politician, when he got into it with Trump, he started lobbing like stupid, childish insults back at him. And it was just almost like, wow, he brings the worst part of who a person is right to the surface. And there's some ways where that's really good. And on the left, they've just absolutely lost their minds. Absolutely lost their minds in opposing this guy. And here's my first big example of that. Kristen Powers used to be somebody on the left that, even though she was on the left, even though she was a progressive, I still had some respect for her, because there would be times where Kristen Powers would go after her own. And you can look back through my tweets, you can look back through my podcast and my radio. When I talked about Kristen Powers, I usually went a little bit lighter on her because she didn't assume ill intent in Republicans or in conservatives. And she also would try to make reasoned arguments. She usually failed, but the point is she tried to make a well-reasoned argument and didn't just, fly off the handle and say a bunch of crazy things that most of the people on the left would make. A lot of the stupid arguments that play well with their base, but don't really make sense to any thinking person that's trying to figure out whether or not that makes sense or not. Kristen Powers was one of the few people that would actually try to make reasonable arguments and treat Republicans as though they were intelligent and their policies and their ideas were at least worth considering, even if she disagreed with them. All that's gone. She has gone really off the deep end in the past several months, and I guess she's got a really bad case of the TDS, the Trump derangement syndrome, and it is on full display in this clip that we'll show here just in a second.
One of the first things is that people will say that they support him for reasons other than his racist language, which we don't have time to go through. But there's all sorts of things starting from the launch of his campaign all the way up until the latest campaign, the way he demonized, people trying to come to our country on the caravan. And they'll say, well, I'm not racist. I just voted for him because, I didn't like Hillary Clinton. And I just want to say that that doesn't make you not racist. It actually makes you racist. If you support somebody who does racist things, that makes you racist. So I just want to establish that. As for why white women do it, I think we have to recognize that white men are doing it as well. But I think sometimes we would hope that we would get better behavior from white women because white women are themselves oppressed and that they would therefore be able to align themselves with other oppressed people. But I think we have to remember that the white patriarchal system actually benefits white women in a lot of ways, and they're attached to white men who are benefiting from the system that was created by them for them, and their fathers and their husbands and their brothers are benefiting from the system, and so they are also benefiting.
Okay, so there you have it. Kristen Powers going full-on social justice warrior with all the crazy, illogical, feelings-based talking points that you would expect from most social justice warriors. And when it comes to this, I don't know. I used to respect her, but she's just lately been really terrible. And her argument that she does there, it assumes two different premises, and neither one of them are actually true. So the first is that Trump is a racist, and Trump supporters believe he's a racist and just don't care. Those are the two. So she's assuming, because if you were to break it down into a logical syllogism, that's essentially what she would be saying. She's saying supporting Trump is racist because Trump is a racist. And thus, the people that are voting for him know he's a racist and just don't care and vote for him anyway. Therefore, if you voted for Trump, you are a racist. If you support Trump, you support his policies, you are a racist. But here's the funny thing about that. That is neither logically valid nor true. Because you're assuming that Trump is a racist, which I haven't seen significant, ideas for. Trump has had some questionable moments for sure. I mean, there's times where he has said racially insensitive things or things that could be construed as racist, but certainly nothing that he's ever actually said that is full on racism. And you look at the cabinet he's put together, you look at the way that he talks about people, because a lot of people will take his strong criticism of guys like the one whose show we just looked at, Don Lemon, guys like Don Lemon and Kobe, and say, well, look how harsh he is to black people. Yeah, he's Donald Trump. He's harsh to everybody. He insults everyone. He treats everybody like garbage, which is not a good thing, but you also can't say that it's racist. If you treat everybody bad, then you can say, well, he shouldn't treat people that way. And you know what? When people say that about Trump, I agree with them. But you also can't say, but he also treats black people bad, therefore he must be racist. No, if you treat everybody bad, you're an equal opportunity offender. And again, I'm not trying to justify his bad behavior. I'm just saying that that bad behavior does not lead me to believe that it is racially motivated. And so a lot of the things that people bring out, the one thing that is kind of credible, well, I say that two things, is back in the day, there were some Trump properties that they had some questionable practices, and they actually got brought to court, and the court found that there were racist tendencies going on in the decisions of the tenants. But here's the thing, at best, that may prove that his dad was racist, not necessarily him. And just because your parents are racist doesn't mean that you are. As we've seen countless times throughout moral teachings, and specifically in the Bible, the sins of the father shall not be held against the son, nor the son of the father. Everybody's accountable for their own actions. But second of all, that's really more of a case of Trump's dad being racist than him because of how long ago it was. His dad was actually running the show back then. And second of all, the other one that people use was Charlottesville, which I condemn the president. He should have come out stronger. He should have never said that there were good people on both sides, because I didn't believe that. I think they were all bad people. And when I say that, I mean Antifa and the alt-right. I was very, very forceful in my condemnation of Trump not coming out stronger against it and trying to sort of hedge that, okay, well, maybe there's some bad elements on the alt-right, but there's some good ones too. No, they're not. It's all bad. When your roots are in white nationalism and white supremacy and you want a separate state for you and everybody that doesn't look like you, there's no good there. And complimenting any of the good things that they've done there is like saying, well, and in this case, literally, like saying, well, yeah, I mean, the Nazis did kill 6 million people, but look at the shiny shoes and their trains always arrived on time. Well, that's not a justification. One has nothing to do with the other. So I'm not going to relive that whole thing, but just suffice it to say, that's the only really kind of credible accusation they have, but he did denounce it. He just denounced it late. He denounced it when he shouldn't have. That was a mistake by the president. I was very critical of him, but it doesn't prove that he's a racist. And so you've got that assumption, which is not true, but let's just assume that it was true. You're also assuming that the people that are voting for Trump and supporting Trump know that he's a racist and just don't care. That they know that he hates black people or Jews or whatever else it is, and they believe that he does and just do not care about that. Look, I was not somebody that voted for Trump. I don't consider myself necessarily a Trump supporter any more than I would be for any other president. I didn't vote for him. He has a lot of policies I like, a lot of policies that I don't. He's kind of a mixed bag for me. But nonetheless, I see no credible evidence that he's a racist. But if I did, that would lead me to believe that the vast majority of Trump supporters would not support him. We have gotten to a point in our society, which I think is actually a pretty good thing, that racial animus towards someone is such a detestable quality that people who know actual racists don't want to associate with them. They don't want to associate with them. One of the worst people I've ever had to deal with in my life was somebody that was a racist. And it drove me absolutely insane to have to spend any time with him. Now, I had to because he went to school with me back when I was in high school. But we've gotten to a point in our society, which I believe is a good thing, that people don't want to spend any time around somebody that degrades someone based on their race. And so because of that, and with that in our mind, do you really believe that half the American population would vote for somebody that they believed was an open racist and hated certain portions of the population? Evidently, Kristen Powers does. I don't buy that. I guarantee you, if there was credible evidence that Donald Trump actually did harbor some kind of racial animus towards certain minorities, and I mean, it was clearly racially motivated, there would be a great number of people that would not vote for him for that alone. And I understand that. And so this idea that you're assuming that Trump is a racist, and even if you are, you're also assuming that everybody that is voting for him also believes that he's a racist. Because it's also possible, even though I don't see evidence for it, that Trump actually is a closet racist. But that doesn't mean that everybody that's voting for him believes that he is. They have not been convinced of that. And in fact, the very people that you're saying that they would be saying to me, well, I'm not racist and I don't support. If they're saying they aren't racist, then they are by definition trying to distance themselves from that. That is what they are attempting to do by telling you that, which means they do care about the issue. And if Trump were to prove to them that he was racist, then they would abandon his policy. They would abandon their support of him. And so this is obviously something that they do care about. They just don't believe the guy is a racist. And I don't understand why everybody on the left is so thoroughly convinced that he is. So both of those premises that her argument is predicated upon make no sense. And even if they were true, that still doesn't necessitate her conclusion. Because while I would be very skeptical of someone, and I would actually be on the streets preaching that if someone hates a person based on their skin color or their ethnic heritage, then you do not need to be voting for that person. You can logically get to a point to where even if Trump actually were racist and they knew it, their motivation for voting for him may not be because he is a racist. They may not want to be evoking racial tendencies in someone. Now, I would argue that that would be wrong, but nonetheless, her argument, even if her two premises were true, still don't necessitate her conclusion. And so, looking at it from a rhetorical perspective, not only is it not logically sound, it's neither true nor valid. So it fails the logic test on literally every level. And the reason that Kristen Powers feels confident in doing this is because she knows that she is making an appeal to people's emotions. She is not appealing to a person's sense of logic. And as far as the Trump being a racist thing go, you could make an equally compelling case that Hillary Clinton is a racist. if you're looking at the evidence against Trump, which again pretty much amounts to something that his dad did, and the way that he handled Charlottesville, you could make an equally compelling case that Hillary Clinton is a racist. She has said things that were racially insensitive before. Just a few weeks ago, she was saying to a black person, well, you all look the same to me. I mean, had that blunder in there. You remember the interview that she did with the black audience where she tried to ingratiate herself to it and was saying that she carries hot sauce around in her purse, which was obviously not true. This was a racial stereotype that she was perpetuating, which again, I don't think makes her a racist. But what I'm saying is the evidence against her is equally compelling. There's also that clip of her sort of adopting and even some would argue mocking a black person's vernacular when she was speaking to a largely black audience, saying, I think the exact wording was, I am no ways tired, or something like that. And you could interpret that as mocking black people. There was also her husband, who when they were in Arkansas, they had, and I know it doesn't bother me, but the people that see anybody with a rebel flag anywhere, they permanently condemn as a racist that has no chance at redemption whatsoever. Yeah, Bill Clinton ran, and there were bumper stickers that said Clinton on them for governor, and it had a rebel flag as the backdrop. They also went to a country club that was all white and had a history of keeping people of different races out of it. Again, I'm not trying to make the case that the Clintons are racist, but I'm saying there is at least as much, if not more, evidence of a underlying racism with them than there would be with Donald Trump. That's all I'm saying. So the hypocrisy there is cranked up to 10. And I want to very briefly touch on the last thing that she said, that white women are voting for Trump because of the patriarchy. And I don't understand why an oppressed class like women would vote for him, but when he's taking out other oppressed classes, they should be able to sympathize with the oppressed classes. Well, first of all, please explain to me how women are oppressed. That's one argument I've never seen any good points on. I mean, they have the ability to vote. They can go out and make money. They have the ability to succeed in virtually any endeavor they take. I don't understand this idea of women being oppressed. And I've yet to hear a compelling argument for that. I mean, the wage gap, that's been completely debunked. They are physically, less imposing than men, but again, that's not an oppressive thing. Nobody's trying to oppress them in that. You can be in an individually oppressive relationship, but on the broad scale, on the larger level, women can do essentially whatever they want, and that's a good thing. So this idea that they've been oppressed is ridiculous. But she says that, well, white women are benefiting from the patriarchy. Well, if by patriarchy you mean women getting married, then yes, I agree with you. Women are benefiting from marriage and families, and so do men. And so if you're talking about the patriarchy as the way that we are married, the relationships, the complementarianism that takes place between the genders, then yes, women do benefit from that. And so do men. And this is really a underlying problem with a lot of liberal thought, is they believe that and unfortunately Trump has this as well, that if somebody is winning, somebody else must be losing. If you have something, it was because you took it from somebody else. That's not the case. It's not a zero-sum game. Part of the reason that God made men and women the way that they did is that they complement each other and they bring something to the table that the other one does not, which means that when done correctly, a male and female working together in concert, be they married or be they business partners or whatever else, they are in a mutually beneficial relationship because they view the world differently, they think differently, and because of that, obviously some more differently than others, and because of that, they are able to reach a place and to reach goals and create a synergy that they would not have in any other way, that they could not create on their own. And so if you're looking at that and the idea of marriage and traditional gender roles, if that's what you mean by the patriarchy, then yes, women absolutely benefit from that. And so does everybody else in a society. But nonetheless, I don't know if this is a recent thing with Kristen Powers or this has been who she always was and Trump just brought it out. But either way, Kristen Powers of late has been really insane. And speaking of Trump having the ability to drive people absolutely crazy and do stupid things, this may be the funniest clip that I've played on the show to date. This is another example of somebody doing something crazy. So to set the scene for you, this particular video was taken by a protester at a protest outside CNN. It was a group of Trump supporters there in Atlanta, Georgia. They got together to protest fake news. So because they call CNN fake news, and again, these are protesters that I probably would have quite a few political disagreements with, but they have the right to protest. They're out there in front of CNN's building on public property, protesting CNN and holding up signs, and they've got all their pro-Trump stuff on and everything. And this happens, and I'll just leave it at that. Leave it to your enjoyment.
You attacked them.
You attacked me. You want to go to jail?
You better move on.
Man.
Hey.
Right. There he is. Watch this guy.
Back off. Hey.
Uh-oh.
Get down. Get down. No. It's all on film. You attacked. You attacked them.
You attacked me. You want to go to jail?
You better move on.
Man.
Hey. Stand back or you're going to be pepper sprayed. Hold this for me. Hold back. Stand back and get off. Stand back. Get back or you'll be pepper sprayed. Get back or you'll be the police got it.
You okay? You need an ambulance.
I did hit him with an aspartame because he assaulted. It's all on video.
Yeah, he just came up and started attacking.
Chill down.
This is all your fault. You guys are all going to get sent to jail.
Hey, sir. Film it. No, just keep it on him. Keep it on the officer.
Okay, so as you can see, this guy attacks the Trump supporters, but it doesn't exactly go his way. Okay, so I know that he got hurt a little bit, and I know that there have been actual protesters that were attacked, and it wound up ending with people dying or getting severely hurt, and so that's no laughing matter. But I mean, come on, you got to admit that was gold right there. The guy just charging up and trying to attack him, and the guy just gets slammed. Oh, that was hilarious. So this guy who runs like a 7-year-old girl, where you see him running up to the protesters there, and he fights like one too. I love his fighting stance was basically like this. He had his fist up, barely clenched, and just kind of swats at the other guy. I've had far more challenging fights when I was in second grade than that guy. So anyway, speaking of people just doing something absolutely crazy, I realized this was technically an assault and he really did attack the guy first, but that was just pathetic. I mean, I don't know how you get around that. And I want you to notice the people there. The guy that's taking the video, he's kind of loud. He's kind of belligerent. He's all wired up and everything. But they're just standing out there, peacefully protesting, not, bothering anybody, not necessarily. They're well within their constitutional rights, is what I'm trying to say, to be able to be out there. And this guy, for whatever reason, his blood starts to boil, and he can't stand that there's Trump supporters there in Atlanta, which is a pretty red state, and they just elected a Republican governor. Congratulations, by the way, on winning that. Like 14 recounts they had to do to find out that the guy actually won mayor, even though they announced it that night. But anyway, so they're there, that whole thing, and the guy just runs up and charge. Here's the thing, a word of advice. And remember, this is somebody who's been a security guard. I'm a first degree black belt in Taekwondo. I've studied several different fighting styles. I don't care if you're anybody short of basically Chuck Norris. Charging 15 people when you're by yourself is a really dumb idea. Because there's probably, 15, maybe 20 people hanging out around there based on the video. Even if it's less, even if it's just 10. But I'm pretty sure there were more than that. Did he really think that it was a good idea or he was going to be able to do a lot of damage, being the 5'0" stick figure that he is, just randomly running up to these people and trying to attack them. Did he really think he was going to make a statement or accomplish anything with that? He's one guy against a mob. And he just, in a blind rage, even though he was across the street, these people weren't bothering him, just goes up and attacks the guy. And of course, he gets, smacked right down on the pavement afterward. But how did he think that was going to end? Even if this guy were like Rambo, like I couldn't have taken out 15 people by myself. And he was the one attacking first. So how did this play out in his mind? How did he think this was going to go? I think the answer is he wasn't thinking. I think that he put no thought into this. And that's why we saw exactly what happened here. But the whole thing was just horribly amusing to me. But I want to make a comment about the protesters. Even though they were being sort of loud and obnoxious, which is what a protester is. I mean, I've protested too. And so to get your message out there, to be seen and heard, that's kind of the purpose of protesting. And so I understand that. But, maybe they're a little bit obnoxious. But again, they're not bothering anybody. And when this guy actually attacks, you'll notice that they showed an amazing amount of restraint. Because he gets up, he attacks them, they basically just smack him right down, and he lands on the pavement. He gets up a second time, thinking it's going to go better this time, somehow. And again, just kind of holds up his fist and kind of swats at him, and then gets immediately smacked down right after that again. And the guy grabs him and pushes him down on the ground instead of jacking his jaw or something else. And like I said, this is a little bitty dude, and he was facing a lot of people. He could have gotten seriously hurt if they wanted to hurt him. But they showed, I thought, an amazing amount of restraint. And you saw the guy doing the video say, stop, back off. I've got pepper spray. If you get up again, I'm going to pepper spray you. And then when the cop shows up, they're like, okay, he's going to handle it. And they just back off. They don't leave the premises. I mean, they're still standing there. They're still doing their protest. But they back off and let the cop handle it. See, if Antifa behaved that way, I may disagree with their message, but I wouldn't have a problem with Antifa actually engaging in the protest. Those guys showed an amazing amount of restraint. To this idiot who thinks that he's going to take on a bunch of 15 Georgia rednecks, and I use that term endearingly because I'm a redneck myself, but he thinks he's going to take on 15 Georgia rednecks that support Trump, and somehow that's going to go in his direction. So they just absolutely smashed the guy, and they could have destroyed him. They could have put his life in danger if they wanted to. But they didn't, even though he attacked first. And so I applaud the protesters for doing this. I thought an amazing amount of restraint, but this does prove my point that even the mention of Trump makes some people just, their eyes gloss over and they get into this blind rage where they'll just do these crazy, stupid things. We're taking politics too seriously. And I think that this is really sort of another indication of that, because you have actual people on the left and the right too. Don't get me wrong. It happens on the right. And I've talked about that as well. But here recently, the left has just done so many crazy things that you would have never expected them to do beforehand. You look at the way that Antifa has handled things in Berkeley. There have been multiple protests where people get arrested. They get tear gassed because they're breaking the law. They're breaking property. They're hurting random people that aren't even connected to Trump in any way. And they've also got them trying to shut down ICE facilities. I mean, just all kinds of things. They actually took an ICE facility hostage in Washington and in Oregon. That one actually happened that one was in Washington. Just making sure I had my story straight. So, I mean, this has been happening all over the country, specifically in the more liberal regions. And if those same protesters just exercise the kind of restraint that the Trump supporters did, show their face, don't look like a thug, don't look like a criminal, don't try to intimidate people, have your message, say it out there on public property, and then walk away and go home. Trying to intimidate people, trying to hold them hostage, trying to break businesses, break property, that's just not effective. And it's illegal. And even though I'm just guessing here, but I would probably disagree with these protesters on a number of political issues, I don't have a problem with them protesting. And if Antifa just adopted that kind of restraint, I wouldn't have a problem with Antifa either. Let's go straight to the daily dose of stupid.
No, you messed it up. You're stupid.
Okay, today's Daily Dose of Stupid, it revolves around guns, because there are a lot of dumb arguments when it comes to guns, but this may be one of the dumber ones, and that is saying something. I've always said for a long time, guns are one of the few issues that almost all the research, all the legitimate, studies that have been done on it, all the stats, all the facts happen to be on one side of the argument, and that is the pro-gun argument. And so it's really funny, some of the really bad arguments that get used here. And this particular one comes from a actual Democrat presidential candidate. You may not have known that there were any yet, but yes, a guy from California, Representative Eric Swalwell, has announced that he is going to run for the presidency on the Democrat side in 2020. And so even though that's a ways off, he has already announced, and the truth is, the second one is probably not too far off. I'm guessing somewhere around February, maybe March, we're going to have another Democrat presidential candidate. But nonetheless, so this guy, Swalwell, he got into this confrontation with a screenwriter named Joe Biggs, who was tweeting about how he'd never sell his gun in a buyback because that's one of Swalwell's policies, is he believes in gun buybacks. And so Joe Biggs gets into this argument with him. They go back and forth, and he's saying, well, I would never sell my gun in a buyback, which is a sentiment I understand. I'm the same way. You could offer me all kinds of money for my gun for a government buyback. I would never sell it. I'm not going to disarm myself willingly. And so he was kind of reflecting the same sentiment that a lot of gun owners have. So Swalwell, when this happened, it's important to understand that the buyback program that he's talking about, when it was done in Europe and Australia, the buybacks were mandatory. Now in America, there have been some minor attempts to do buybacks. There's one right here in the city of Montgomery. I think maybe 5-6 guns every time they do it, which is like twice a year. So maybe a dozen guns a year. Now it doesn't do anything to curb crime, because the people that are criminals that want to use their guns to do bad things, they're not going to give up their guns. It doesn't do anything for the lawful gun owner. The only one that usually winds up showing up to this stuff are little old ladies that are selling off their husband's gun collection or something like that. You do occasionally have that. But as far as the gun buybacks, there's very little success. There's no statistic whatsoever that shows that they actually reduce gun crimes. In fact, usually the cities that have these buyback programs are the ones that have the highest gun crime rates. So at the same time, there's been no evidence whatsoever that this does anything to solve gun violence. But nonetheless, this is Swalwell's big pitch. This is his big plan. And when Europe and Australia did the same thing, their buybacks were mandatory. In other words, it wasn't really a buyback. It was a confiscation and compensation, which I guess is kind of theoretically better than just taking your gun from you. But it's just taking your gun from you by force and then giving you money for it, which I'd rather have the money than not have the money. But let's not pretend that this was anything other than a gun confiscation. And by the way, speaking of that, later, when Swalwell actually was accused of being someone who favored gun confiscation, straight up compensation, he replied to that tweet with agreed. And he's also made comments about that in the past, that at the very least, assault weapons should be confiscated from people forcibly. No grandfathering in, none of that. That we should go out and actually take guns from people. So this is the kind of person he is when it comes to gun policy. He believes in taking people's guns away from them, even if they had bought them legally at one point. So that started this whole little tirade, and he tweets back one of the dumbest gun arguments out there. Let's go ahead and look at this tweet. Okay. This is Representative Eric Swalwell, and it would be a short war, my friend. The government has nukes, too many of them, but they're legit. I'm sure that if we talked, we could find common ground to protect our families and communities. Okay, so a couple of things. First of all, he's saying, I don't even like nukes. I don't agree with nukes, but we're totally going to use nukes against gun owners if we started a war. That's stupid on a multitude of levels. First of all, this is the reason that it's one of the dumbest anti-gun arguments that there is. First of all, nobody nukes a place they want to control. If you are an oppressive government and you want to control the land, you want to control the people, you don't nuke your own country. Does he really think the people in Washington are going to say, oh, we're having all these trouble with gun owners out in, I don't know, Minnesota or Alabama? I think we're going to have to nuke them. Okay, click. That's not going to happen because they want to own the land. I mean, they could theoretically, but then the only land they would control would be worthless nuclear wasteland. And so it would do them no good. The only people that you nuke are enemies that you don't want their land, that you don't care what happens to their land. You just want them gone. And so you can't control people that are dead. And second of all, is he really going to nuke gun owners? Because nukes are not like pinpoint accurate missiles or anything like that. When you nuke a city, the whole city gets nuked whether they supported the Second Amendment or not. And so it would be very hard to distinguish between gun owners and non-gun owners if that were to take place, or even gun owners that weren't rebelling at that point. But nonetheless, here's the issue that's underlying this, and this is the beauty of the Second Amendment. You're not going to be able to nuke and wholesale wipe out your own population. Now, it's possible that some other country could nuke us, but they're not going to do it. If you don't believe me, read Mockingjay. Mockingjay, it's a fictional book. It's in the Hunger Games series. The reason that they didn't nuke that particular area, and I won't say it because it would give away spoilers. Maybe there's somebody somewhere that doesn't know the story. Not only would that not do anything, but it doesn't help the government that does the nuking because they want to control the facility. You cannot destroy that which you want to conquer and control, whether it be people or a location, facilities, resources, whatever it is. You don't nuke that which you want. And so that what they would have to do is they would have to come in manually. Now, granted, the military has fully automatic weapons, and they have all kinds of other resources that could take out an area. But the point is they would still have to go in manually. And when that happens, who do you think is better equipped to take on that military force? Now, are they as well equipped as the military force invading? No, but they are better equipped than they would be if you took their guns away. And so that is the idea here. So even if there were, let's just say it was a foreign nation. Let's just say China, I'll just use some random country, decided to invade the state of Alabama. Do you have any idea how long, even with superior military hardware, it would take to take the city of Wetumpka and Millbrook and Montgomery and Clanton and Prattville? I mean, it would take them a week or 2 weeks to take every little podunk town in Alabama because there's guns everywhere and people that know how to use them. Now, would they be able to take it over and be able to win a lot of battles and probably kill more of our people than we would theirs? Yeah, but the point is, that would slow them down considerably. You march into a town without guns, you control that town basically automatically. And so when you have armed resistance, when you have people that actually have somewhat of a fighting chance, even if the equipment isn't exactly on par, it's way better than what they would be unarmed. And so because of that, it would take forever to conquer America because of that. It would take forever to conquer this country, considering you've got 400 million guns and several hundred million gun owners. We don't know the exact numbers, but the point is, it's a lot. You had that Japanese general during World War II that said they never even contemplated invading California, invading the mainland of America, because they said there would be a gun behind every bush, and they were right. It is a deterrent against tyrannical forces because it would take so long. And here's what I find hilarious about this. Liberals will always make the argument, and it's a good argument, one that I think they actually have a good point on, that we don't need to be getting involved in other countries because it's a quagmire. So whether you're talking about Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, we don't need to be getting involved in those countries because it's a quagmire. Okay, well, those militaries, especially the rebel forces, they use guerrilla tactics. They don't have tanks. They don't have fighter jets. And yet, somehow, the American military, the greatest military force in the history of mankind, has had a really hard time wiping out every pocket of resistance. Why? Because they are armed and because they know the land, which presumably would be exactly the same problem if the American military tried to become tyrannical and rule over the American people. They would be facing pockets of resistance. They would be stuck in a quagmire over here too. And so liberals cannot simultaneously make the argument that it's a quagmire and we're never going to be able to do anything with it, and we'd never be able to actually conquer that country, be it Iraq, Vietnam, whatever, because there would be pockets of resistance and people with guns and armed resistance, and then simultaneously say, but in America, that would totally not work, even though we have more guns and far better equipment and people that are better trained in it than they do. Guns are not a commonplace item in the Middle East. They're just common amongst the terrorists because they make it a point to get them. In America, a lot, especially in the South, a lot of everyday citizens are armed, which would make it even more difficult to take over here. And so this argument that, well, you wouldn't be able to stand against the American military, A, well, we'd have a much better chance with guns than without the guns, and B, at that point, you can't make that argument that it would be a quagmire, it would be impossible to take over, and then also make exactly the same argument but in reverse and say, but it would never work in America. We're better equipped than they are to handle that. And so that really is something that he doesn't seem to have really a big handle on. If the Middle East has all these unwinnable wars, then why would it be so easy to win and easy to conquer the Americans who have guns? The answer is it wouldn't be. There's no system of logic underlying that or no rational thought. So let's look at a follow-up tweet that he had. This is basically him taking a step back and analyzing the debate. So he says, America's gun debate in one thread. I propose a buyback of assault weapons. We've already dealt with that. Gun owner says he'd go to war with the USA if that happens. We already established that too. I sarcastically point out that the USA isn't losing to his assault weapon. It's not the 18th century. I'm called a tyrant. Zero progress. So probably not an altogether unfair characterization of the argument, but he also didn't disprove any of the arguments made against him in doing so. So again, when it comes to the buyback, there's no evidence that it has ever actually worked. Criminals don't participate in buybacks, and so the only people that wind up doing so are legal gun owners that don't really want their guns. And so the only way to do that would be manual confiscation. And if that happened, just like it did in Australia, just like it did in England, actually in the UK, I think gun crime went up about 30% in the initial years after that buyback, and then it started tapering off, but still it just now got back to the levels that it was before the confiscation. So it did no good, cost all kinds of money. And if you were to equate that, because we have way more guns than they did, let's be conservative. Let's guess that roughly half the guns in the country would qualify as assault weapons under his proposed policy. So that's about 200 million. So if we've got 200 million guns, and the thing is, if they are assault rifles, if they're the quality firearms that he's talking about, let's be uber conservative and guess that they would be valued on average around $1,200. Because I can tell you, a lot of the people that have assault, what he would call assault weapons, even though they're really not, if you were to take a price of each part and how much it would cost in a buyback, you're running about $2,000 a weapon. But let's be conservative. Let's give him every benefit of the doubt. Let's say it's just $1,200 on average. Okay, well, that means the cost would still be $240 billion to do a buyback. And it would solve no problems. It would cost us about $250 billion. And you would wind up getting nowhere. And you're violating people's rights on top of that. And so the buyback is one of the stupidest gun programs that there is. And here's another issue that you're running into that doesn't make sense with this argument. Again, this is why it's such a bad argument. It was because it has multiple layers of stupidity, which is why it's part of the Daily Dose of Stupid. Either assault weapons are these uber powerful military grade weapons, or they are not. That's the issue that you're running into. And this is one that they are never consistent on. They'll always say when they're talking about mass shootings, for example, that anybody can pick these up and basically become Rambo right away. They're so easy to use that any idiot can pick up a gun and become a mass killer. And then, by that same extension, when you're talking about using them for home defense, they'll say, well, they're just so hard to use and you're better off using a shotgun. That was Joe Biden that made that argument. Well, they're either easy to use or they're not. And the same thing goes for their level of power. they'll always say that the reason we have to confiscate assault weapons is because they're so powerful and so dangerous, and they can basically make anybody a god who just decides who lives and dies with a squeeze of his finger. These are very powerful weapons, and I don't deny that. But they'll say that exact same thing, and then when they say, but they wouldn't do any good against the American military. Well, if you're saying they're military-grade weapons and that they're so powerful, but against the American military they wouldn't do anything, you can't have it both ways. Either these are very powerful guns that are so powerful that they're too dangerous to be held by citizens, even responsible law-abiding citizens, or they're worthless and basically having them wouldn't do you any good if the American military decided to become tyrannical. You have to pick one. You can't make both arguments at the same time. And furthermore, we'll just get to his last point. He's upset that he's been called a tyrant, which he should. That is a cut down. But let's look at the Webster definition of tyrant. Tyrant, an absolute ruler, unrestrained by law or constitution. Well, to confiscate someone's guns like that, he would, by definition, be violating a constitution and the law of the land. And he would be doing so in an oppressive way. So, and I looked at 3 or 4 different definitions that Webster had of tyrant. Every single one of them, somebody that was taking guns would fit that qualification. And let's not forget, our very first act as a country, in the Declaration of Independence, after asserting that we had certain unalienable rights, which guns would have obviously been amongst them because that's what the founders put into the Constitution, we also asserted that King George III was a tyrant. And part of the reason we asserted that he was a tyrant is because he kept us from having weapons. In 1774, they started putting limits on how much powder and musket balls you could buy. In 1775, they started confiscating muskets. And then in 1776, we rose up against them. I mean, there was a little fighting before the Declaration of Independence. There was actually some fighting in 1775. But my point is, part of the reason we declared King George III a tyrant is because he was taking our weapons and doing so to subject us to his will. That's what a tyrant does, and that's what Swalwell is proposing here. I don't see the difference. Because tyrants always fear those who they subject with gaining power, and they don't want them to have it. That's what makes them tyrants. Because that's the fundamental thing that they don't seem to understand about the gun debate. With guns, we are citizens. Without guns, we are subjects, lambs to the slaughter. So let's go ahead and go to the Chaplain's Report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Chaplain's Report this morning. Oh, forgot to turn my camera on. Okay, Chaplain's Report this morning comes from the Psalms, and this is a Psalm of David. And I love the way that David describes God and describes his connection to God in so many of his Psalms, and that was sort of his outlet. It was something that he commonly did. He wanted to communicate his love, his affection, and also his dependence on God. And Psalm 103 is no exception to this. So we'll read the first 4 verses here. Psalm 103, 1 through 4. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. Bless his holy name. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget none of his benefits, who pardons your iniquities, who heals all your diseases, who redeems your life from the pit, who crowns you with loving kindness and compassion. I love this Psalm of David because it is such an expression of David giving thanks to God. And that's part of the theme that we're running with here because it is Thanksgiving, it is upon us. This is David pouring out his soul and saying, Lord, you do so much for me. Things that I don't even think about on a day-to-day basis because you're always there, you're always present, you're always by my side. And it's not just that he benefits him in a material way, because David talks about that too. He talks about, when he says forgetting none of his benefits, he talks about the physical a little bit later on. But look at the first thing here, the first few verses that we read, where he talks about God's spiritual blessings. And while we thank God for our food and our houses and our cars and our modern conveniences, let's also remember to be grateful for the spiritual benefits that God gives us. Like David lists here, someone who pardons iniquities, heals diseases, redeems your life from the pit. It's not just that God makes your life better. He makes you better. He makes you a better person. He has this transformative quality in your life that by associating yourself with God, by following His laws, by submitting yourself to His will and His instruction, you become a better human being, one that's better equipped to serve God, and also one that's better equipped to serve your fellow man and live your life in such a way that helps other people, which David was a big believer in. He was the king of his nation and led them greater than any other king before or since. And part of the reason he was able to do that is because he understood that God was the one that really needs to be in control. He understood that his power wasn't his to use as he wanted. It was a responsibility God gave him. And because of that, he often gave thanks to God. That's prevalent all throughout the Psalms, which I think is a lesson for us. That the grateful person, a grateful and cheerful heart, is one that is not only going to acknowledge and understand his blessings, but will be able to appreciate them more because he understands that they're a gift. He won't take them for granted. He won't assume that they came to him because he's so great. We will see them as responsibilities, as tools that we need to use to serve this world, and most importantly, to serve our Savior. Or as King David put it, the one that extends his hand and pardons our iniquities. That's the kind of God that we serve, and that's the kind of God that we should be joyful to serve. I want you to remember that when we go and be thankful with our families and think about all the benefits that God has given us. Stay the course, friends.